It's one of those things.
We're live. Here we go.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. This is Carrie Mills live from the Gordon JCC YouTube station for our Tuesday talk specials every Tuesday. Oh my gosh, I'm totally screwing this up.
Take two.
So welcome. So today. Okay, I feel like I'm on an SNL skit and now I'm totally losing my character. Okay, so today we have a really special guest. So I want to kind of jump in quickly and tell you about Andrew Maraniss.
You got it.
Yes, okay. He's a New York Times best-selling author. He writes sports and history-related nonfiction. His first book, Strong Inside, was a biography of Perry Wallace, the Vanderbilt basketball player who desegregated the Southeastern Conference in the late 1960s. Strong Inside became the first sports-related book ever to receive the Lillian Smith Book Award for Civil Rights and the RFK Book Award Special Recognition Prize for Social Justice. His second book, Games of Deception, is the true story of the first US Olympic basketball team at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. It received the Sidney Taylor Book Honor from the Association of Jewish Librarians and was named one of Amazon's best books of 2019. Andrew is a graduate of Vanderbilt University and serves as a visiting author at Vanderbilt Athletics. He and his wife, Allison, live in Brentwood with their two young children. Andrew's paternal grandfather, Elliot Maraniss,
Yes,
was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants and grew up on Coney Island before a long journalism career in the Midwest. So we're really excited to have Andrew today, and he's got a lot to talk to us about. And I just want to remind everybody, you can ask questions as we go along. So please participate and get involved with our conversation today because we love that. And so I'm going to hand it over to Andrew so he can go right into all that he's about, which is really going to be fascinating.
all right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carrie. And thank you also to Alex for the invitation to speak to this group. I love the JCC, and Mr. Gordon himself is a figure in my life. I interviewed him for the book you mentioned, Strong Inside, about Perry Wallace. When Perry was a student at Vanderbilt in the late 1960s and was one of not just the only black basketball player in the entire Southeastern Conference, but one of the only black students at Vanderbilt, period.
Whoa.
And he told me that it was Mr. Gordon who would invite him out to his house just for a cookout in the backyard when no one else was doing that, extending that friendship to Perry, and also connected him with the JCC for summer jobs. And Perry was a camp counselor and a basketball coach at some camps through the JCC back then, even in the late 60s. And so I know how much Mr. Gordon meant to Perry, and anyone who meant something to Perry means something to me. And I had a chance to talk to Joel also as I was writing the book. So just wanted to say that anytime I have a chance to be around the Gordon Jewish Community Center. So today I thought I'd spend most of the time talking about my latest book, which is called Games of Deception. And it's a story of the first US Olympic men's basketball team, which played at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. And I've got a bit of a slideshow here to walk through as I talk about this book, which just came out in November. And as everyone knows, the world sort of shut down in many ways in March. And so I only had a couple months really to be out on the road talking about this book. And, as schools and book festivals have gone online this fall, another chance to talk about my new book, which I was really excited, as Carrie mentioned, received a Sidney Taylor Book Honor this year from the Association of Jewish Librarians. And, that meant a lot to me in terms of the credibility of the book, is not just being about basketball, but being about more important issues than that. I wanted to give you a sense of where I come from and why I'm interested in writing about sports. This is me when I was 13-year-old kid living outside of Washington, D.C. in Silver Spring, Maryland. And I used to play baseball at the boys club back then, even before it was a boys and girls club, that old. And then I started my own sports magazine here called AJ's Sports Journal. And for all of one issue in December of '83. And I wrote about my favorite teams, which were Milwaukee Brewers and the Green Bay Packers. I'm originally from Wisconsin. And I interviewed an author named John Feinstein. And I'm sure many of you know of John or have read his books. He's probably now the all-time best-selling sports author ever. Back then, he was a reporter at the Washington Post. And my dad at that time was an editor at the Post. And so they were friends. And John came over, and he was the first person that I ever interviewed. If you fast forward a couple years after I created this magazine, we moved to Austin, Texas. And so I went to high school in Austin and played baseball there and was sports editor of our school newspaper. And one day I was walking down the hall at my school, and there was a poster on the wall advertising a scholarship to Vanderbilt. And it was a sports writing scholarship named after Fred Russell and Grantland Rice. Many of you probably read Fred Russell's columns for years. If you subscribe to the Banner, if you read the Banner, he was sports editor there, I think, for 50 years. And Grantland Rice preceding him, as the best known sports writer in the country in the early part of the 1900s, both Vanderbilt graduates. And so there's a full tuition sports writing scholarship to Vandy, still exists today. And I applied for it from Austin. I'd never been to Nashville before. I'd never heard of Vanderbilt before. And one day, a few months later, after I applied for this scholarship, my mom and my sister showed up at my school, my high school. And I was so embarrassed that my mom and sister had come during the day to the high school. Like, what are you doing here? And my mom was crying, had no idea what was happening. And she was crying what my daughter now calls happy tears, that she said that Vandy had just called and said that I had won the scholarship. And so that's how I ended up coming here to Nashville with sort of an automatic interest in sports and in writing, and it was paying my way to college. In my sophomore year, I was taking an African-American history course taught by this woman here, Dr. Yolette Jones. And we had an assignment in her class to write a research paper about a figure in Black history. And I had just read a newspaper article about this person named Perry Wallace, who I'd never heard of before. Perry had graduated from Vandy after making history as the Jackie Robinson of the SEC in 1970. And here it was 1989 when I was in college. And this was so almost 20 years later. It was the first time that Perry was ever invited back to campus to be recognized for the pioneering he had done, for the history he had made. And so after reading this article, I thought, this is someone I'd like to learn more about. I'd like to write my paper about Perry. And I was concerned, however, that Professor Jones would say, we don't write about basketball in college. We don't write about basketball players. That's not a serious enough topic for Vanderbilt, especially. And so thankfully, however, she had the attitude that William Zinsser has. And I didn't know this quote back when I was in college, but he said, there's no subject you don't have permission to write about. Students often avoid subjects close to their heart because they assume their teachers regard those topics as stupid. No area of life is stupid to someone who takes it seriously. If you follow your affections, you will write well, engage your readers. And so she said, if that's what you're interested in doing, go for it. That's what you should do. And so I lived in Tower 3, the ugly brick towers on West End that they're in the process of tearing down. I think Tower 3 is the first one that they blew up. And so that's where I was living at the time. And I called Perry, who at that time was living in Baltimore. He was a law professor at the University of Baltimore. He was the first Black tenured law professor at that school. And just called him out of the blue. And he spent 2 hours on the phone with me that night, a stranger's kid in Nashville. And that was the most meaningful 2 hours of my whole college experience, I would say. And so I wrote this paper, which is fun for me to look at now. Before I wrote a book about Perry Wallace, I wrote a paper about him with a handwritten cover. I'm right on the line technologically where I showed up at college with a typewriter, not a laptop. And so I typed my paper in November of 1989. Perry's life stayed on my mind for years after I graduated. I worked at Vanderbilt. I stayed in Nashville for 5 years after graduation, working in the athletic department as the publicist for the men's basketball team. And then I moved to Florida and did essentially the same thing for the Tampa Bay Rays baseball team. I came back to Nashville and was working at a public relations firm here for almost 20 years. And at one point during that span, I was at my in-laws' house, which is where I am now. Our internet at my house is spotty, so I'm at my in-laws. But I was at this house and I declared to my father-in-law that I wanted to write a book. And he asked the logical question, well, what do you want to write a book about? And that stumped me, which was kind of silly that I had declared I wanted to write a book without knowing the subject. And he said, well, what about Perry Wallace? You know, you're always talking about Perry Wallace. And I was like, too close to it. I was like, yes, of course, that's it. And so I emailed Perry the next day and reminded him about the paper that I had written. This was in 2006. So that paper I had written 17 years before. And he said, yeah, I remember you. If you'd like to write a biography about me, you know, that's fine with me. And so I got started. That next day I interviewed Roy Skinner, who had been Perry's coach at Vanderbilt, and really had no idea how long it might take to write a book. I thought maybe a year or two, and it took me 8 years. So I spent 4 years on the research and interviews before I wrote a single word, and then another 4 years writing the book. And so finally in December 2014, the edition you see on the left, the black and white cover, that's the original adult edition of Strong Inside. And about 2 years after that book came out, I met another great author here in Nashville, Reuter, who writes historical fiction for high school age students. And she asked if I'd ever thought about adapting Strong Inside as a book for young readers. And at that point, I never had even considered it, but Reuter really encouraged me to think about it. And not only did she encourage me, she sent my book to her publisher in New York and recommended that they work with me to create this young reader edition, which was really, really kind of Reuter. And so it happened. And so a couple of years ago, this young reader edition of Strong Inside came out, and I've spent the last several years traveling to middle schools and high schools all over the country, talking about Perry's story, which really is less about basketball and more about civil rights in Nashville and what it was like as a pioneer in the South in the 60s, where Perry thought he might get shot and killed just for stepping onto the basketball court. And what it really took, the toll that it took on a pioneer. You know, we think about what a good thing it was that he did and how that changed sports in the South and in this country, but what did it take out of this young man, 18, 19, 20 years old, put in that position, and the way that he went on to live the rest of his life as a attorney for the U.S. Justice Department and a professor of law at American University for the last 20 years of his life until he passed away just a couple of years ago. And then the healing with his university, a reconciliation that took a long time to come. He was essentially run out of Nashville, and many of you, if you were around in the late 60s, remember how Perry's career ended here, where he told the truth in the Tennessean about the racism that he had encountered. And a lot of people didn't want to hear that. And he felt almost as if he was run out of town. But eventually, over the years, things really improved, and people began to understand him and to listen to him and really understand he'd been telling the truth all along. And so when Perry was passing away of cancer in DC, he told me he wanted his memorial service to be held at Vanderbilt. And so the athletic department, we arranged that service, and it was really quite a full circle moment to see that happen. So anyway, I've been, you see these other pictures visiting schools all over, and one of my trips was to Lawrence, Kansas. And I had a chance to speak at the Dole Institute of Politics, which is basically Robert Dole's presidential library if he had ever become president. And while I was there, it was my first time in Lawrence. I really wanted to see Allen Fieldhouse, where the Kansas Jayhawks play basketball. And so I took a tour. You see this picture here in the middle. Those are the original rules of basketball. So when James Naismith invented basketball in the 1891, he was smart enough to save those pieces of paper where he wrote down the rules. And there was quite a bidding war just recently between Kansas and Duke, both great basketball programs, and they wanted to win these rules to be able to showcase in their arenas and claim that they're the home, of basketball. And so Kansas won the auction. They have the rules there. And you see this other picture here of Naismith with the Japanese basketball player from the 1930s. The guy who was showing me around said, "Did you realize that the inventor of basketball, James Naismith, was able to see his sport, his invention played at the Olympics?" Excuse me. And I didn't know that. And I asked, "Well, which Olympics was that?" And when he said it was the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, I knew right then that I had the subject for my next book, looking for sports stories with a larger social and historical message. And so I got started researching this book. And as I was writing it, three primary threads emerged. One was Naismith. Who was this man? Why did he invent the game? Number two, who were the players on this team? If you're my age and you think about the U.S. Olympic basketball team, you think about the Dream Team and Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan and Larry Bird. Or if you're a little older and you think about the 1960 team, I think that's probably the most famous of the earlier teams with Oscar Robertson and Jerry West. Our kids now think about Kobe or LeBron on the U.S. team, but who are these guys that were on the first team that are basically unknown? And then most important, as you see the third picture here of the German and Nazi fans at the Olympics, what was the state of the world at that time? And what was it like for these athletes to travel to Hitler's Germany to participate in those Olympics? And what are the lessons learned from those times and how that relates to sports? Here's a picture. I love the sketch here on the left. This is the very first basketball game that was ever played. We have a sketch of it. And I think that's just amazing. We don't know when the first baseball game was ever played or who was the first person to go golfing, but we actually have an actual sketch of the first basketball game that was ever played. James Naismith was a Canadian. He was from Almonte, Ontario. He had gone to undergraduate college at McGill in Montreal, came to the United States to go to the YMCA, International YMCA Training School in Springfield, Massachusetts. And this was a school that was training young men from around the world to go out and run YMCAs back all over the world. There was a theory called Muscular Christianity. Prior to, I guess since the mid 1800s, there had been a sense that athletics were a bad thing to be engaged in if you were, a man of the church. Like you should be spending your time working or praying or in church and not wasting your time playing sports. But this new theory of muscular Christianity said if you develop your body, that's a good thing to do as an individual and to honor God in that way. And so Naismith believed in that. And that's why he was at this school in Massachusetts. The students at this school played baseball in the spring, they played football in the fall, but they really had nothing to do in the winter. They were bored. They had a gymnasium before basketball with nothing in it. They marched around, they did calisthenics, they played leapfrog. These are guys in their 20s playing leapfrog. And so they were rebelling in this one course that Naismith was taking. And his professor, Luther Gulick, encouraged someone in the class to invent a new game, keep the students busy in the winter, and then they could share this game with other YMCAs around the world who are having the same problem of nothing to do in the winter. And so this is December 1891. Naismith has 2 weeks to come up with his assignment. And like any student, he waits until the night before it's due. And that's when he envisions the game of basketball in his mind. And the next morning, this game is played. And there was a student from Japan who made the sketch of the very first game. This other picture you see here, Naismith later went on to become the athletic director at the University of Kansas. And he's with Phog Allen, who's the famous Kansas basketball coach. It's who Allen Fieldhouse is named after, the place where I saw the rules. And it was Phog Allen who really took this invention that Naismith had. And Naismith really only cared about basketball as a form of exercise, a way to keep people busy in the winter. Phog Allen was the one who envisioned basketball as a game that could be coached, as a game that people would want to pay to come watch, as a sport that you could have a tournament. He invented the NCAA tournament also. And he was the one who pushed for basketball to be included in the Olympics. Initially, he thought that he would be successful by lobbying the Los Angeles Olympic Committee in 1932, but they chose to play an exhibition football game instead. But Fog Allen had connections inside Nazi Germany. There was a foreign exchange student named, blanking on his name, I'll remember it, Fritz Zwicky, who had been at a basketball camp in Massachusetts where Fog Allen was one of the guest coaches. And Zwicky became friends with Fog Allen. They were basically pen pals. Zwicky goes back to Germany and takes a position within the Hitler Youth movement. And Fog Allen is coordinating with him to sort of publicize the game of basketball in Germany with Olympic officials there to get it included on the docket for the 36 games. Hitler and the other Olympic organizers were really concerned that the United States might boycott the 36 Olympics. And they would lose all the propaganda of hosting the games if that happened. And so one reason why I think that they included basketball for the first time in the Olympics at these Berlin games was to sort of throw a bone to the United States and say, we're going to play your game that's been invented in your country, and hope that that had an influence on the American Olympic Committee, as it was known at that time. So there, once they got the word that basketball would be included in the Olympics, and Fog Allen got a letter from Karl Diem, who was the head of the German Olympic Committee at that time, saying, you're successful, your lobbying has paid off. They had to determine how would they put this first Olympic basketball team together. And they did it very differently than we do now, where players are, invited to be on the team. Prior to that, you like at a high school, you would try out for the team as individuals. But they did it differently in 36. They had entire teams compete in a qualifying tournament. And they said whichever two teams advanced to the championship game of this tournament, which would be played at Madison Square Garden, that those two teams would be combined to become the U.S. Olympic basketball team. And so they invited all the best amateur teams in the country to play in this tournament, which were college teams, AAU teams, and YMCA teams. And the two teams that advanced to the U.S. qualifying championship that were then combined to become the U.S. Olympic team, one of them was this team here. They were from McPherson, Kansas. And these guys played for an AAU team, which is Amateur Athletic Union. And at that time, the AAU was company teams, industrial league teams. So these were players who had played basketball in college. There was no NBA back then. So there really was not many opportunities for former college basketball players other than playing for these company-sponsored teams. They maintained their amateur sports status because they were paid to work at the company, not to play for the basketball team, even though the only reason they were hired to work at these companies is because they were good basketball players. These guys were 6'8", 6'9". They played for the Globe Oil Refinery in McPherson, Kansas. They were called the tallest team in the world. And the guy who's second from the right here, his name was Joe Fortenberry. He's considered the first player ever to dunk the basketball in a game. And he did that during this tournament at Madison Square Garden. And a New York sports writer saw this unusual shot and had to figure out a way to describe it for his readers in the paper. And he said that it reminded him of a diner customer dunking their donut in coffee. And that's where the term dunk comes from this guy, Joe Fortenberry, from the McPherson Refiners in 1936. Now, the team that they played in the U.S. championship game came from the other side of the country, from Los Angeles, from Hollywood. They worked at Universal Pictures movie studio, which had been founded by the guy you see here on the top left, Carl Laemmle, who was a German Jew who emigrated to the United States and founded Universal Pictures. His studio was famous for horror movies back in the 1930s. And the head makeup artist at the studio was Jack Pierce, who you see here in this other picture in the middle. And Pierce created the looks for movies like Frankenstein and Hunchback of Notre Dame and Wolfman. He's famous to his horror movie buffs. But he was also a big basketball fan. And he's the one that started the Universal Pictures basketball team. And they used us as a form of advertising back in those days. They would take their team around the country dressed in these Universal Pictures uniforms, carrying the Universal banner, and they would show up in small towns, and it was a way to promote their movies. In fact, Jack Pierce would dress up these players in costumes like the Frankenstein monster, and they would come out and entertain the crowd before they played a basketball game, and then go back in the locker room and change out of their costumes into their basketball uniforms. So these were the two teams that were combined to become the U.S. Olympic basketball team, the first American Olympic basketball team. Now, there was a question of would the United States and should the United States even participate in these Olympics? And I went to the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati and listened to a sermon by Rabbi Stephen Wise in New York, where he was, arguing against participation. Found pictures like this here of thousands of people marching through the streets of New York, protesting Hitler and the idea of participating in his Olympics. The best college basketball team in the country at that time was from Long Island University. And they had a chance to participate in this qualifying tournament if they wanted to, and would have been favorites to advance to the Olympics. But they took a vote as a team to boycott the Olympics and even to boycott the qualifying tournament. Can you guys hear this dog? There's a dog next door that's whimpering, and I hope it's not too distracting.
I don't hear it, yeah.
All right. So they voted as a team to boycott the tournament, which I thought was very interesting when you think about sports and athletes and protests today, that even this was happening in the 1930s. And these players from Long Island University took a stand, and their names have been really lost to history. So I thought it was important in my book to include a picture of their team and to list their names for the statement they made in boycotting those Olympics. But Avery Brundage was the president of the American Olympic Committee at the time. He was a very anti-Semitic person. I visited his archives at the University of Illinois, saw all the anti-Semitic magazines and newsletters he was subscribing to, the letters that he was receiving and sending to anti-Semitic allies in the United States. He was even coordinating with actual Nazis to influence public opinion in the United States, encouraging them to send quote unquote positive news coverage of their regime to American newspapers, try to influence public opinion in the US to prevent a boycott. And eventually he was successful. Of course, we did participate in those games. And here's a picture of the SS Manhattan. So we didn't fly to the 36 Olympics. The entire American Olympic contingent took this ship to Germany. And it was July 15th, 1936 that it set off from Manhattan to Germany. And I read newspaper articles from New York Times, New York Herald Tribune about this scene that day. And they described it as being like the 4th of July. It was a beautiful summer day in New York. The ship was red, white, and blue. People were standing on the shore waving their American flags. There were bands playing, Sousa. And but I found a mention at the end of one of the articles about one protester that was there. His name was Richard Reuter. He was an American who had been held prisoner in a Nazi prison for 9 months. Thought that he might be executed, but they released him. He came back to the United States and was trying to warn people about what he had seen happening in Berlin. And he showed up at the dock, and he was sort of the lone dissenting voice there at that celebration. And he was holding a banner that said, "Boycott Nazi Germany, land of darkness, boycott Hitler, keep America free, fight for race tolerance, democracy, and peace." And of course, it was too late by then. The ship, sails right on by past the Statue of Liberty and is on its way to Germany. And this is the Germany that the Olympians arrived in. As I was looking through photos from the United States Holocaust Museum, it was very eerie for me to see these pictures of the streets of Berlin decked out with the familiar Olympic rings right next to the swastika, as if that was totally acceptable. Reason my book is called Games of Deception is that the Germans tried to deceive the world during this 2-week showcase that they had for the Olympics into believing that, everything was just fine there. And maybe what people had read in American newspapers or newspapers around the world simply wasn't true, and that that this was a hospitable place for the Olympics. The streets were clean, the people were friendly, and of course they're distracting from what's really happening. And there was really the Sachsenhausen concentration camp had already been built about 15 miles from the Olympic Stadium. This picture here of Joseph Goebbels, there was a feature article on him in the New York Times leading up to the Olympics, and it was essentially a puff piece, a favorable article about him. And in the story, he talks about the truth being irrelevant. And in his country, truth didn't matter. What mattered is if what you said, if people believed and acted on what you said, that your rhetoric was good. If they didn't act on what you said, then what you said was bad. But the truth was not part of that equation. And of course, how scary that is, and the echoes we see of that today. And so, this book is about the mid-30s. And so I wrote, that the road to the Holocaust was paved with bullying, lies, propaganda, and a cynically calculated encouragement of intolerance. And this is where the world comes running and marching in for the Olympic Games. Back to basketball, this is what the basketball tournament looked like. And so you can see, obviously, they played outside, which is unusual. The first and only time that Olympic basketball has been played outside. The opening rounds worked out okay. The picture here at the bottom, you can see they turned some old clay tennis courts into the basketball courts. And it worked fine for the first few rounds when the weather was good. But the gold medal game, US versus Canada, was played in a driving rainstorm. And the court, you can see, starting to get muddy there and wet. By the second half of the game, the players couldn't even dribble the ball. It would just get stuck in the mud and wouldn't bounce back up. The ball itself was incredibly heavy and waterlogged. And so this, what should have been the greatest game in the history of basketball, its first gold medal Olympic game, was a farce of a game. The final score was 19-8, which was a really low scoring game even for those days. The players on the American team had really hoped to show the world what good basketball looks like, but they didn't get that chance. They said they mostly played keep away in the second half, just trying to get this game over with. They were muddy and cold and wet, and so it was really a joke of a game. This picture here is of Frank Lubin. He was a college player at UCLA. He was one of the players on the Universal Studios team, and he was the one they would dress up like Frankenstein before games. His parents were Lithuanian, and after the Olympics, the country of Lithuania invited Lubin to stay in Europe and really come and teach the game of basketball there in Lithuania. And so he did that. His wife came over to the Olympics, and they stayed in Berlin for several days after the Olympics before they went to Lithuania, just as a vacation. And Lubin was the one player that stayed behind. All the rest of the Americans came back home after the Olympics. And so he was the one that saw this facade that had been built for the Olympics come crashing down. All the anti-Semitic posters that had been taken down during the Olympics go back up. The signs on benches or at restaurants or swimming pools. He saw all of that. And so he was the one American player that eventually came back with a better idea of what might be to come. Holocaust, 6 million people murdered. He's also incidentally known as the father of Lithuanian basketball. And the great competition to the United States in the 60s and 70s was the Soviet Union, which by that time included players from Lithuania. And so when the Soviets beat the United States for the first time in 1972, these were players that were coached by the guys that Lubin had coached in Lithuania. So there's a connection between the first US Olympic team and the great Soviet teams of the 60s and 70s. They still know his name there. He's like the James Naismith of Lithuania. And as I was writing this book, I was reading a lot about the early days of basketball, a lot about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, about just that period in history. And it was kind of like going to a graduate school for me in sports and in history. And of course, I read Knight, I read Elie Wiesel's Nobel Peace Prize speech. And so this is what really I hope is the message of the book, and basketball just as a way to get there. But he said, those who kept silent yesterday will remain silent tomorrow. He was talking about the aftermath of the Holocaust. But, and I take that to as a challenge to us to understand that the people who are on the wrong side of history now, can't count on them to realize that and atone for it and speak up at some point in the future. It's up to the rest of us to do that now. He said he swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. You know, and this idea of silence and neutrality, helping the tormentor, not the tormented. And again, a challenge for all of us to use our voices and not be silent. And so I wrote in the book, if the first casualty of Nazism was the truth, then we must tell the truth about the past, call out dangerous lies in our own time, and raise alarms when we see justice or humanity imperiled. History has taught us we cannot be bystanders. That's also the message of my book about Perry Wallace. You know, when he talked about his experience as a pioneer in the SEC, people would expect him to say, and it was true, that it was very difficult for him to go play a basketball game in Mississippi or Alabama or Louisiana in 1968. You know, and that was horrific scenes at all of those places. But he said the most difficult part of his experience was here in Nashville on his own campus at Vanderbilt, where people could have and should have, his teammates or his classmates, they should have seen what was happening, the way he was being ignored or isolated on campus. You know, when he would come and sit in class, people wouldn't sit next to him, or wouldn't even sit in the row behind him and the other Black students. And they weren't, of course, allowed to join the fraternities, which is all the social life on campus at that time. And so it was a lonely 4 years for him. And he was surrounded by bystanders who were people that would tell me, well, you know, I wasn't the person that slammed the door in Perry's face, and I wasn't the one that called him the N-word, and I didn't kick him out of church. I didn't do anything. And then they would realize they told me that they didn't do anything when they could have been there to be an ally to Perry Wallace. So again, this danger of being a bystander. And so last slide, this man here, Dr. Al Miller, I was lucky enough to meet him, and he kind of embodies this idea of speaking up. He's now 97 years old. He lives in Cincinnati. At the time of the 36 Olympics, he was a 13-year-old Jewish kid living in Berlin. That's him on the left in the old picture. He was the last Jewish kid at his school in Berlin. All of his friends had been bullied to the point that their parents had pulled them out of the school, but he wanted to stay and play soccer with his friends who were now joining the Hitler Youth. Al Miller attended the 36 Olympics. He rode his bike to the Olympic Stadium and saw Jesse Owens win a gold medal. He said the first African-American person he ever saw was the fastest man in the world, Jesse Owens. At age 14, the next year, his parents can sense what's happening in their country, and they get out of the country. They send him to the United States by himself. He's not sure if he'll ever see them again. His father goes to the hospital to have 2 unnecessary surgeries, 2 appendectomies that he doesn't need, as a way of hiding from the Nazis in the hospital while they're looking for him at his house. His wife is staying with a friend. She's looking for fake passports to allow them to get out of the country. Eventually, she's able to get those passports. Her husband leaves the hospital, and they are able to escape and reunite with their son in the United States. During World War II, Dr. Miller is old enough to enlist in the U.S. Army, which he does, and because he speaks fluent German, he is used to interrogate Nazi POWs. After the war, he becomes an eye doctor in Cincinnati for years and years. And I met him as I was researching this book. And he told me that still to this day, he speaks to kids in Cincinnati twice a month about the lessons of the Holocaust and the lessons of that period in history. And so I asked him, what do you say to kids when they ask you, how do we make sure something like this never happens again? And he said he tells those kids that they already know the answer. And typically they've already stated the answer that morning at the start of the school day with the hand over their heart when they recited the Pledge of Allegiance. And he said the most important thing that we all need to remember are the last 5 words of the pledge, which are liberty and justice for all. And that we've seen the hate and the violence that is inspired throughout the world when people intentionally leave out those last 2 words, for all, right? And say only certain people are worthy of humanity or of these rights. And so we always must fight and tell stories about those times and about this notion of liberty and justice for all people. And so that's the final message of my book. And I was so excited to meet Dr. Miller and be able to hand him a copy of the book when it came out. So that's the story of Games of Deception. Carrie, I don't know if there have any questions have come in, or if you'd like to ask any. I'm also happy to talk about my other books. I've got one that will be coming out in March and another that I'm researching and starting to write right now. Thank you so much.
Oh, this is really incredible. I mean, it's quite honestly, it's frightening that, what was almost 100 years ago is just, it's like we're seeing it today stronger than ever. It feels
Right.
like. A comment came in from, so I just wanted to read that. It was a Facebook comment. Coincidentally and relevant to what you're saying, yesterday, Mark Zuckerberg finally decided that Holocaust deniers should not be permitted to continue to post their lies on Facebook. So that was a comment, which,
I saw that yesterday when I was online, and it was, I mean, how do you react to that? Obviously, it's good news that they're not allowed to do it anymore, but horrible news that it took this long for Facebook to have that policy, right?
And what's even more horrible is that people still deny the Holocaust.
Right.
I mean, that's like, okay, where do you go with that? So, and what are your thoughts on, well, there's two things I actually just want to expand upon. So first of all, like last month, we saw the NBA players, boycott, they decided to end up playing, but they all joined together, and I was actually painting my apartment, and I was listening to the whole, when it was all unfolding, and their remarks, and so what, why they were doing what they were doing, and then counter remarks from people upset by what they were doing. And it was astounding to me that we're still in this conversation of racial injustice. And so I was just wondering, is that another book for you, like, just about where the NBA is, or what are your thoughts on that? If you even want to expand on that a little bit, the present day situation.
Absolutely. And it relates to both Strong Inside and Games of Deception also, in this idea of do or should sports and politics mix, and there's some people that say that they should be kept separate. I think one of the themes of Games of Deception book is that sports and politics are inherently intertwined, and always have been. If anyone thinks this is a new phenomenon, 36 Olympics are probably the best example of how sports and politics have always, or their historical precedents for that relationship. The only reason the Nazis wanted to host the Olympics was for political purposes, for propaganda purposes. With Perry Wallace, the fact that he was the first Black basketball player, and it wasn't until 1968 that the SEC desegregated. Of course, that was a political decision to exclude people from basketball or from sports, for so long. Jackie Robinson, Major League Baseball, is a political decision that they made for years before he was desegregated the league. I think some people think of athletes as entertainers.
Right.
They are to some degree, but they're people first, they're citizens first. And so they're entitled to have an opinion and entitled to use their platform, I would say, to express that opinion. And now more than ever, athletes have a gigantic platform and audience that they don't even need the media as a filter, right? I mean, if they choose to use their Twitter account to say what they believe, they've got millions of people reading that, right? If they want to kneel before an NFL football game, there's millions of people seeing that. And I think that Perry Wallace would be really proud, if he were alive today, to see athletes using their voice, being full citizens off the court or off the field, and feeling the freedom to do that. Although he would also recognize that the price that they pay in some cases for doing that. When Perry spoke the truth in the Tennessean interview after his last game, people called him ungrateful, and they told him to get out of town, and that he shouldn't be talking. And he paid a heavy price for that. He never lived here again. University didn't invite him back for 2 decades to honor him, and you see athletes paying a price for that now. Colin Kaepernick can't get a job even as the NFL is painting end racism in their end zones, and sort of co-opting his message, but still blackballing him. So, but I think the larger social impact that these athletes are having is obviously more important even than what they might be able to do on the field.
Right. It's almost like we're in a crisis of humanity right now,
Yeah, I think everyone needs to be doing whatever they can
Right.
On social and political issues in this country. And athletes, for better or worse, I mean, you could say, why should we listen to athletes as opposed to teachers or politicians? But people pay attention to what athletes are doing, and if they want to take advantage of that attention in meaningful ways, more power to them.
I wanted to also just expand upon I just love the idea that you were asked to turn your original book into a book for younger readers.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious, as a writer, like, what is that process like? So are you telling, because I haven't read either of your books, so
Sure.
That's terrible as an interviewer to not have read your
That's
book.
okay.
So I apologize for that. So what is the process from when you take your original book into a young reader? Were you still telling the same story? Or did you make it into like a story? Like, what's the difference, and how did you approach that in the process? I'm just so curious about that.
Sure. So with Strong Inside, I adapted the original book for basically middle school, high school students, more thinking about middle school students in mind when I was doing it. I had help from an editor at Penguin in New York who had done this with other books before. We took a book that was close to 200,000 words and turned it into a 40,000 word story. And that was the main difference between the books is the length. I didn't dumb it down or take out the hard or controversial parts or anything like that. It was just a real exercise in editing. And to do that much editing, it required removing some side characters who just weren't essential to the story, removing some of the additional background on Nashville and Vanderbilt that I had in the adult edition, sticking a little bit closer to the pure action in the story. The kids' attention span, can be a little bit of an issue. And so they're not really in it for backstory, like, let's stick to the action. And so that was the main difference between those two books. With Games of Deception, I just wrote one book, not two, and it's considered a young adult book. And that's because of the length, not because of the subject matter or the way that I researched or wrote it. I mean, most of my readers are adults, but it's considered a young adult book. Much in the same way, more adults read Harry Potter and a lot of young adult fiction, that's ostensibly for teens, but adults are just as much of a reader. And so I don't see a reason why the same can't be true for nonfiction also, especially with the demands on people's time. The same story told in maybe 2/3 the length is appealing to adults too. And so if you picked up Games of Deception, what you would notice is there are a lot of pictures in it, and the pages are, the spacing is a little bit closer to maybe 1.5 spacing rather than single spacing, which makes it easier for younger people to read. But other than that, I think it's a book that adults will enjoy just as much as high school or middle school students.
I'd love before we went live, we would talk. You started to tell me all these things. I was like, oh, tell them when we're live about your forthcoming books. But also, before we even do that, I think it would be great to let people know about the Ocean Societies, the Sports Society, all of those things, and how people can get in touch with you and how they can maybe learn from you live and all of that. So
right. So my day job, in addition to writing these books, is I work at Vanderbilt Athletic Department. And one of my responsibilities there is managing what's known as the Sports and Society Initiative that the late athletic director, David Williams, launched about 3 years ago. And so we put on, in non-COVID times, public programming, bring in speakers to talk about these issues related to race and gender in sports. Right now, if any of the viewers are interested in these topics, every Friday, I send out an e-newsletter with basically a digest of the most interesting 5 articles or stories, videos of the week related to those topics. And I would love to add anyone to that distribution list. Carrie, if they send you or Alex their email address and you forward that on to me, I'll add folks to the distribution list. If people want to email me themselves, my email address is just andrewmaraniss@gmail.com. No dot in there, anything, just my full name, andrewmaraniss@gmail, and I'll be happy to add you to that list. I'm also teaching for the 4th time now an Osher lifelong learning class. I'm sure many of your viewers have participated in those classes. Every semester, Vanderbilt offers very low-cost classes in a lot of really interesting subjects. There's 6 courses each semester, or 6 weeks of each course each semester for, I think, $60. Mine right now is called Race, Gender, and Sports. And we meet every Wednesday from 11 to 12 over Zoom. And I interview people who are in this world, either as authors or journalists, former athletes, coaches, professors. Last week, we had a woman who has written a book called How to Love Sports When They Don't Love You Back, about sort of ethical issues facing fans right now. Tomorrow, I'm interviewing a man named Sean Kelly, who's a Vanderbilt alum who started the Gay Olympics, what were known as the Gay Games, back in the 1980s. And you know, I don't know, since we've already started this class, if they're still accepting new folks for this semester, but I do this all the time and would love to welcome folks to join this class in the future.
That's fantastic. So anybody listening can always contact Alex at, it would be alex@nashvilljcc.org, or just call the JCC, ask for Alex Heller or Carrie Mills, and we'll be happy to put you in touch so we can keep the connection going.
Okay.
I just love all, you know, what you're doing, the importance of what you're doing, because education is, to me, the foundation of change. When people, you know, start to really question things and think for themselves and understand things, the history, and understand things on a deeper level, I feel like it's a much stronger, you know, proponent for change for the good.
Yeah, I sure hope so. And that's why I'm interested in writing for younger people, you know, and through sports, which I think can come across as a accessible way to get at a social justice topic. You know, I don't think many kids would be intimidated by picking up a book with a basketball player on the cover, where they might not pick up a book about racism in the 60s or anti-Semitism in the 30s, you know, but basketball, the Olympics, that might sound fun to kids, you know, and so I'm trying to get them interested in reading and to think about history and these social issues through sports is my genre that I'm developing.
Somebody just, one of our listeners just posted, love your newsletter. I've been reading it since I went to one of your talks. So there you go.
That's great.
Yeah, well, I'm sure there's a lot more of our listeners out there who have, you know, been involved with all of what you are doing. So, but I hope that the people now who are just learning about you today, you know, will get involved as well. So
that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. So tell us now, because you have more books. You have a book that you are coming out with, and then you have a book that is in incubation. Or
that's right.
Right. Okay. So why don't you tell us about that? Because we still have, well, we don't have much more time. We only have a few more minutes. So maybe just a quick synopsis of each one.
Okay. So on March 2nd, so coming up this coming March, I have a book coming out called Singled Out, and it's a biography of Glenn Burke. And Glenn was an African-American baseball player from Oakland, California, who is considered the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. He played for the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Oakland A's in the late 1970s. And he's also the inventor of the high five. And he and Dusty Baker did the first high five in the fall of 1977. And Glenn's story is fascinating, from his childhood in the Bay Area to his process of discovering who he really was as a minor league baseball player, dealing with homophobia in the major leagues, being run out of Major League Baseball by homophobic managers and executives, finding happiness after baseball, living in the Castro district of San Francisco, right, however, as AIDS was coming along. So just as he is comfortable with himself and living where he's supported, all of his friends begin to die. Glenn becomes addicted to drugs. He's hit by a car. He gets AIDS and dies in the mid-90s. So it's a tragic story, but to my knowledge, there has not been a biography of a gay male athlete in one of the major sports of baseball, basketball, and football, period, let alone a young adult book on this subject. There's been autobiographies written by folks like Billy Beane, another baseball player, or Jason Collins, a basketball player. So this will be a bit of a groundbreaking book in some ways, so I'm excited about that. I think middle school, high school kids are ready for this type of subject, which I don't know, even going back to when I was in middle school or high school, I don't think a lot of kids would have been comfortable picking up that book or carrying it around school, you know. So this is gonna be really a fun experience for me. I can't wait for it to come out. The first book review is coming out this Thursday, and I had a chance to read it, and it's a starred review, which is the best you can hope for. So I'm really excited about that. And then I'm now researching a book I haven't even started writing that will come out in 2022, which is the 50th anniversary of Title IX, you know, the legislation that led to a boom in women's athletics at the high school and college level. And this book is about the first US women's Olympic basketball team. So I did the men in Berlin, and when I would speak at schools, a lot of the kids would say, well, when was women's basketball first in the Olympics? So that was the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. There's a Tennessee connection, and me as a Vandy guy, I have to admit, Pat Head Summit was a player on that first women's Olympic basketball team. And she was already the head coach at UT at that time, but she was a player on that women's basketball team in '76. And so this is a book that is in the context of the women's rights movement in the 1970s and what pioneers these women were. And they won the silver medal. They lost to the Soviets that year, but we've won the gold medal, I think, every year since. And so they got things going for US women.
I'm so impressed, and I'm so happy to have met you today and to have learned about everything that you have done so far and are about to do. I mean, I just, it's very exciting, and I think it's important. Thank you so much for being our guest today. I mean, this has really been really just fantastic to learn and to hear just from you about your, you know, what change that you're helping to bring forward in our world of never estimate people's intelligence, and children's especially.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah. That was a big message from my publisher is respect their intelligence. They can handle it, you know.
I feel that exact same way. Yeah.
Yes. And so Carrie and Alex, really appreciate this opportunity. Everyone who's watching, thank you. If you're interested in the books, you can get them at Parnassus here in Nashville. Or online, however you prefer to get your books, but support the local bookstore first is always my first message. But thank you very much.
Oh, same here. Thank you. We hope too that once all of this passes, oh please, it can't be quick enough, that we can have you have you come to our center and speak live. Mm-hmm. That would be fantastic. We'd love that. So thank you again. And I have a feeling we'll have a lot of new connections and keep this relationship moving forward with the Gordon JCC. And congratulations on your books and the books to come. So I'm thank you from my heart, and hope to just stay in